In today's video, we're talking about Foregone, the 14th studio album by the Swedish heavy metal band In Flames. This album was released on February 10th, 2023 through Nuclear Blast Records, and it was produced by Howard Benson. Now, this is going to be very important for this video because Howard Benson is a guy who produced bands like Daughtry and 3 Days Grace, but also produced In Flames and their last couple of albums. Some of them are more like melodic, more like alternative rock or alternative pop-styled albums of the 2010s. This album, it's more of a return to form. They're more of an old school style. They're a little heavier. They're sounding a little bit more like they did in the 90s, but not too much. So that's going to be what we're going to be talking about in this album. Like, is this a return, or are they kind of moving forward or moving backwards towards that sound? So let's talk about that. I'm just going to give a quick history of the band. So they were formed in 1990 in Gothenburg, and that's like the center of this melodic death metal with bands like At the Gates and Dark Tranquillity. So those three bands, they kind of pioneered the genres known as Swedish death metal and melodic death metal. The first album, Lunar Strain, in '94, that was like a completely different band, completely different lineup. It was raw, and actually Anders wasn't in the band yet. He was actually in Dark Tranquillity. And then in like late 90s to 2000s, that was like their heyday with the Jester Race, Horacle, Colony, Clayman. Those are the albums that like everybody usually goes back to and says they love. After that, they started to change their sound more into a metalcore or alternative metal sound. So albums like Reroute to Remain in 2002, up until like Siren Charms in 2014, they started going more, you can say downhill, but more melodic, more accessible, more commercial, more of that like alternative metal. And I think by the time Battles was released in 2016, they were just completely like a pop, like alternative rock band. They released I the Mask in 2019. That was their last album. Now, in that album, they were kind of moving a little bit towards that like older style, but like not too much. I actually like that one. And that brings us to this album, Foregone. Now, one thing about this album was they released 5 singles prior to the release of this album. So 5 singles out of the 12 songs on the album, which means we already heard 42% of this album. And yes, I did the math. It's not an exact number. It's kind of rounded, but we heard 5 out of the 12 tracks. Now, when the first single came out, it was State of Slow Decay. It was released back in June of 22. And I remember, like, all the metalheads were kind of like going crazy. They were like, "Whoa, this is pretty cool! You know, In Flames are heavy again. It sounds fast." Like everybody had like the lowest like expectation for this. Like, pretty much everybody thought like In Flames was pretty much like completely done. But they were surprised because it was good. It was fast. It was classic In Flames. It had the harsher vocals, the melodic parts. It had that winning formula. They're just like the band like never lost their heaviness. Afterwards, I think the second single was called The Great Deceiver. And another one, it was still heavy, harsh vocals. It mixes the heavy and the melodic. Has the great drums, the nice changes in rhythms, the nice melodic interlude, and a nice break. And at that point, you know, all the metalheads were like, another great single. I'm like, wow, maybe I'm interested. I mean, maybe this is going to be a really good album. Then they released 2 more singles, Foregone Part 1 and Foregone Part 2. It's a 2-part song. So this is one where it's just, again, classic In Flames, the old school heavy sound. It's fast, it's aggressive. You know, Anders has some killer vocals. They incorporate the acoustic guitars. The song is still heavy. You got some electronic elements, but they don't overpower the song. And then part 2, which is more like the acoustic guitar and more softer parts, has some, you know, softer elements. Now this reminds me of those, I guess I call them like a pair song, where bands like Pantera and Slipknot did them with Vermilion and Suicide Note, where like the first song is like very heavy and the second song is a little more like lighter, or like a little softer. That one reminded me a lot of that. Now you want to know, what does the rest of the album sound like? It's really good. It's enjoyable. There are no bad tracks. I think I liked all of the songs. So let me just talk about them real quick. So the opening track, The Beginning of All Things, is just an instrumental. It's all acoustic, the violins, the cello, things like that. It reminded me of like old Black Sabbath. songs like Fluff from the like early 70s period. So I like that one a lot. Bleeding Out, that was track number 4. That was kind of like mixed in the middle. This one has kind of this marching band kind of drum beats, harmonized guitar riffs, a little slower, a little darker, a mix of the heavy and light vocals. So that one was pretty good. Pure Light of Mind, this one had like an Iron Maiden kind of feel. They're bringing the melodic harmonized guitars, softer and doomier vocals, more atmosphere on this one. And tracks 9 through 12 are all like non-singles, and this is a really great like closing to the album. So in the Dark, this is heavy, old school thrash and death metal riffs. Little sludgier, a little darker, a little slower. Reminded me a little bit of Lamb of God a little bit, and they added those like acoustic classical parts. And you get a lot of that throughout the album, that those like little acoustic classical things. And talking of classical, a dialogue in B flat minor actually sounds like a classical music piece. But the song is kind of groovy. It has that classic death metal guitar riffs. Sounds still very melodic. Got some heavy, chunky guitar riffs, and it sounds more like modern In Flames, but still heavy, and has that cool classical music style outro with acoustic guitars. Then Cyanossure. This one has a cool bass playing. It's melodic with clean vocals. They experiment a little bit with the sound, but it's just classic sound, not very fast, just a nice melody. And the final song, End of Transmission. This one is very catchy. I'm actually surprised they didn't use this as a single, because this is one of the most like sing-alongable songs. Like the chorus, it's kind of repetitive. It's like, end of transmission, nothing makes sense, no one is listening. Something like that. I don't remember if that's exactly how it sounds, but it has that repetitive chorus, which they kind of repeat over and over again. And that kind of makes it a very catchy song. So they put a catchy song as the last song on the album. So anyway, it's a good album. It's still very accessible. I think they're moving more towards that 90s sound, but they're not completely like abandoning that like melodic sound of the more like the modern period. I think like it's a case of the band wanting to do that melodic sound, but the fans wanting them to go back to like Horacle and Jester Race. And it's kind of like they're almost like compromising, I guess you can call it, where the fans want it heavy, but they kind of want that melodic sound. So it's a nice step in a nice direction. It's probably like one of their best albums in a very long time. I think if you're a longtime fan of In Flames, you'll like it. So like I was saying in the beginning, it was produced by Howard Benson, the guy who produced like Daughtry and 3 Days Grace. So you are going to kind of get a little bit of that in the production, but it's still heavy, it's still In Flames, it's still melodic death metal, and I liked it. I thought it was very good. I think it has a really good replay value, and that's all I have to say about it. My score is going to be an 8 out of 10. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this album. I thought it was very good. And that's all. I'll have some more album reviews. Check out this playlist of 2023 new album reviews. It's starting to build up. I think I have like about 10 or 11 or 12 so far. So thanks for watching. See you in the next